I'm Simon Kay, the Policy Director at the Restate think tank and Director also of our work stream called Reimagining the Local State. Welcome everyone for coming. This is a really important discussion that we're going to be having today called Innovation from the Regions. How public services can be revolutionised within places. Part of what we're doing today is showcasing, exploring, sort of sensitivity checking the idea for OPSI, the Office for Public Service Innovation, which is being sort of tried out and experimented with right here in Liverpool by the Liverpool City Region. Liverpool City Region are kindly sponsoring this event, making it possible, which I'm really grateful for as well. And we've got a brilliant speaker from Liverpool too. So why is public service reform, public service innovation important right now? It's sort of an easy to answer question, but worth repeating, I think, because it's important. Public finances are seemingly becoming ever tighter. Public services are under increasing and unprecedented pressure. A kind of a perfect storm is evolving within public sector provision of public services. The response to that can't be, because of those tighter finances, the spending of ever greater resource. Actually, what we need to do is we need to imagine a new set, a creative set of solutions, of new ways to integrate public services, to bring them closer to communities, to bring communities of interest and communities of purpose closer to the process of creating our public services as well. And that's been recognised by this government, rolling out, for example, total place style test, learn and grow experiments, which are supposed to go nationwide from next year. So in parallel, the most ambitious devolution policy in decades is also being rolled out by this government. The expectation is that this devolution revolution will produce elected mayors across the country in every part of England, and combined authorities or strategic authorities to go with them. What hasn't been explored in as much depth is the possibility that these institutions, these regional or sub-regional institutions, can play a big role in coordinating and promoting really creative approaches to public services. They can help to reformulate the way that the state does its business in the arena of public services. And I think we've got a case study on our hands here, but also loads of room to develop policy that asks more from this government, because there's clearly a window of opportunity to do so. So in no particular order, to discuss all of this, I'm joined by this fabulous panel. I'm joined by Jack Shaw over here, the Director of Groundwork Research. Groundwork Research has only been going for how long now, Jack?
So it's a new think tank, yes, 2 months.
2 months. It's a new think tank, but we don't think of you as competition. We think of you as friends. And Jack is a long-standing friend of mine and of Restate as well. We're joined by Sue Jarvis, who is the co-director of the Heseltine Institute, which has been around for a bit longer than 2 months. How long's
2012.
2012. All right, so that is a lot longer than Groundwork Research. It's not a competition, of course, but Restate has been around for 23 years.
We have a previous name.
Down at the end there, I've got Rachel Jones, who's the Chief Executive of One Knowsley, which is a really important thing. Did I pronounce Knowsley right?
You did.
That's good. Okay, I did practice that a little bit at home because it's a challenging thing for a dedicated southerner like me to say. And of course, Kirsty McLean is here, representing our sponsor today, and is the Executive Director for Public Service Innovation. Thank you and welcome, Kirsty, as well. So let's get down to it. Jack, I'll go to you first if that's all right. You've argued in the past that English devolution needs a bunch of different conditions to be in place in order to make revolutionary change possible in things like public services, coterminosity, so that the geographies of devolution line up with each other, the idea of getting the scale right, getting the leadership in that scale right as well. Can you give us a sense of why those conditions need to be in place? And can you give us a sense of what the potential prize is for innovated public services?
Yes, and let me do the kind of classic response, which is I'm going to do some scene setting first and then answer your question. And I don't work in Liverpool City Region or Liverpool, so I have less Liverpool specific knowledge. But I mean, you touched on a couple of the kind of challenges or opportunities in the sector: local government reform, devolution, finance, which is a big challenge but presents an opportunity around reform. It presents an opportunity for us to kind of conceptualise place and public service delivery differently. And you've got a government that's willing to kind of test or engage and experiment in these ideas. The question, of course, of how long they're willing to do that and whether or not they're willing to put more money into the £100 million pot of test and learn is an ongoing question. At the same time, those opportunities are also challenges and therefore kind of present a dilemma. So while we need devolution and while we need public service reform more than ever, it's even more difficult, I think, to deliver it in current context. So not only have you got that level of disruption, but you've got a whole host of fiscal centralisation or the lack of autonomy that places have to drive and deliver public service reform. You've got specific sectoral challenges. So if you look in local government, you've got an interim market where leaders, chief execs are moving around very quickly. So it doesn't provide that long-term stability for long-term public innovation. And so that, I think, is a bit of a dilemma that we're seeing in the sector at the moment. And while we're beginning to see the fruits of public service reform, you mentioned, Simon, total place, so the idea of kind of corralling funding around the place. That's one way of doing it. There's this idea of the kind of liberated method or the kind of radical help that Hilary Cotton has talked about, which is around people and renegotiating the relationship between people and public services. And we've begun to see kind of specific initiatives. So, you know, if I was from the Tony Blair Institute, I might be talking about tech and innovation and tech adoption, for example. And we've seen that be quite successful in some places, predictive analytics, etc. And of course, in the Northwest, we've seen quite a lot on housing and housing first. And we've seen Greater Manchester actually begin to take the reins on homelessness when traditionally that's seen as a responsibility of local authorities. So it's good to see that combined authorities are stepping into that space, given that they have the scale and coterminosity, which I'll segue onto. I mean, coterminosity is really, really important. In Manchester, it's the only place in England where they have a coterminous boundary, the same boundaries with probation geographies. So it's the only place that they can begin to kind of work with probation teams to address some of the challenges that they face. And they've worked with particularly women and reoffenders there, and they've had some success in that case. But there are a kind of whole range of areas, whether it's NHS boundaries that are different, whether it's regional schools commissioners, for example, resilience forums or resilience forums, and how you think about those at scale, how those intersect with travel to work areas as well. And so all of these different public service geographies operate at different scales and are not coterminous, they do not share boundaries. And so that limits the extent of public service innovation we can expect to get without kind of changing what I think is that key enabler. And then just very quickly on scale, Liverpool City Region's got 1.5 million people roughly, 1.6 now. It was 1.55 when I checked, so I should have
Round it up.
1.6. That's a kind of good size to be operating at. And most places, so if you go to France, for example, the average is 2.5 million. What we're beginning to see, though, is places like Cumbria with 500,000 people saying, you know, is this a viable opportunity? Or places in the northeast that have just shy of 1 million. And I think if you start to get to that level of scale, you will lose the benefit that coterminosity and public service reform offers. So I think that's just a challenge to be mindful of.
There's also I'm going to do a quick follow-up if that's all right, Jack. There's also the question of not only the population scale, but the distributed nature of some of these new strategic authorities. They're going to be more rural. Population density is going to be a lot lower. Public service delivery is just different in that context as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, North Yorkshire was the first combined authority to kind of describe itself as kind of principally rural. The South West has this kind of particular challenge. It's a really big geography, the South West. And not even parts of the South West like each other or visit each other. So how do they work together? What I don't think we've grappled with yet is we conceptualise devolution in the context of city regions. And so the kind of question about what makes them different and how does that difference materialise in the context of its priorities, in this case public service reform, I think it's really unclear at this stage.
Good. Thanks, Jack. Sue, can I come to you next? I think it's important to sort of figure out the relationship between constituent authorities and the regional authority, the city region in the case of Liverpool. I mean, some people would say it's the local authority, it's the council that's all about public service delivery. Strategic authority is supposed to do what it says on the tin, focus on strategic, bigger picture stuff. So what's the role of strategic authority in enabling that stuff? Isn't it sort of a weird fit?
I think you're right to make that distinction between delivery from a local authority perspective and that more strategic role that you can apply to a combined authority from an institutional perspective. But what I would say that is in practice, innovation demands boundaries to be porous. So it's a bit, it's not about just doing something in one particular area. And I think this is where combined authorities can play an important role, because they can do that in a way that a local authority cannot do that, because they've got that wider reach on co-terminosity or not, depending on which public services you're talking about. So I think the benefit of a combined authority is that ability that they have to convene and coordinate and to catalyse change across their area. But if we look back at the trajectory of combined authorities, there's a case that you could say that they were very much looking at public service innovation policy by policy in the early days. So if you think of my declaring interest, I previously worked with the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority and was responsible for the devolution of the adult skills budget. So that was very enclosed in terms of a certain policy theme. But now they've moved to a position where they can adopt that whole system approach, and that's come through developing relationships and learning as they go through and being able to sort of fit within that strategic role. And I guess, why is that obvious? Well, because they cover a wider footprint, they can join the dots across the different strategies that are out there, so they can link transport to skills and to housing and health inequalities, because these things don't stop at a local authority boundary, so you're able to work on that wider footprint. And what they also can do is they've got that conversation directly with national government, so they can bring in that from a sort of vertical policy and a horizontal policy approach to all of this work. I think what they can also do, combined authorities, that is easier for them than local authorities, is that they can create that space for innovation. So providing that environment where you can experiment and you can test and learn, I think is really important. And I think what's really relevant in the Liverpool City region is we've got a lot of pilots happening across the patch, whether they're through the combined authority, through the Liverpool City Council, through other local authorities. So there's a clear role here for the combined authority to try and knit some of this together, and that's where Opposite can provide a valuable role. And then just a couple of other points of why I think combined authorities are the right size to be doing this is they do bring that strategic leverage and resources. Their scale allows them to actually amplify local capacity for innovation and to align different funding pots, attract the investment that's needed, and to have time to build partnerships to deliver on public service reform. And if I just give an example from the University of Liverpool's perspective, we have something called the Civic Data Cooperative, which is funded by the Combined Authority. It's based in the University of Liverpool, and it's actually a groundbreaking data stewardship initiative. So it's working across the NHS, it's working across local authorities, academia and the private sector, very much trying to connect organisations and citizens with data to improve public services. And we wouldn't have been able to set that up without the support of the Combined Authority. And I think a final thing to just flag up where combined authorities perform a different role to local authorities is in terms of how you shift in the system towards prevention, because councils have to deal with the immediate crisis that's happening with their services. They've got the pressures, whether that's a housing emergency or somebody needing crisis care, they need to get on and do it there and then. Whereas what a combined authority can do is they can take the longer view, so they can reimagine upstream what prevention might be. So I think again that's a really powerful role that the combined authority can do across the place. And just finishing off though, it's not automatic that a combined authority can do this. There's lots of different reasons, and Jack's already set out the challenges of public services that are not coterminous. I think the other thing to flag up is you need some underlying conditions in your locality. You need very much to work with local authorities and other key partners to have all of this work grounded in what's happening in the service arena, and there needs to be a real clarity around boundaries and metrics and whose role it is to do what and not to do what. And then there needs to be a culture of innovation, and again, that's not always easy to achieve, and it's not something that you can achieve quite quickly. You've got to build that over time. And then the other thing on the plus side that combined authority can bring, which just to reinforce again, is that capability through investment in the digital infrastructure and that capacity that they have. So I think the opposite model that's being developed in the Liverpool City region is really timely, and it's something that actually can frame that public service innovation debate that we're having nationally and locally.
Thank you. So let me just quickly come back on that, because part of what you were saying towards the end there, tell me how wrong I'm getting this. It feels like you're turning a disadvantage into an advantage, because one of the defining features of combined authorities, I think all combined authorities, it's fair to say, is capacity is a little bit thin on the ground. Even as integrated settlements roll out, we're talking about organisations with way less resource and usually much less staffing than the constituent authorities that make them up. But by seating this at the combined authority level, do you think it's the case that we're sort of making it partnership based by default, and therefore that sort of feeds into the innovative model that we want to see coming out?
Certainly that's the model that we're doing here in the Liverpool City region, and I think you need to do that because no one organisation can solve the challenges that we've got in public services. So we need to combine our strengths where they are. And I would also say, local authorities have less capacity than combined authorities to do this because they've been hollowed out and they've not got a lot of staff, and they're just really dealing with, that crisis point and the statutory services that they have to.
Right, and this feels like a good moment to bring in Rachel, because partnership working means engaging effectively with communities, with VCSE, with third sector organisations. It's about crossing the boundaries from the state and out into a very different world where people are trying to get things done. So what are those people looking for when they're trying to innovate and change lives on the ground? What do they need from that relationship with the state?
A key message that often comes through that I certainly hear loud and clear and advocate for is equity and parity in the relationships, a recognition that the sector and that not-for-state space is directly, impactfully contributing to public service delivery. And that's not always through a contracted commission relationship. It's through its role in supporting communities, meeting communities where they're at, responding to the needs in communities. We have the ability as a sector to engage with those furthest away. Trust is massive. There may be areas of trust to engage with public service delivery, and we can bridge that space. But if we are contained within a contractual commissioning relationship, the full potential and potential partnerships and unlocking that innovation, the great ideas, will be lost. So from our perspective, we're heavily involved with the combined authority in the opposite space. We see it as a really important space to redefine the environment for partnership, to further enable a cultural shift, because the danger in devolution is that we just get more layers to do to communities, not with communities, and not really listening and responding to what we're hearing from our communities. So we feel it's a really valuable space that we advocate for and we're actively involved in, because as colleagues have said on the panel, everyone is so busy in a resource depleted context to do far more with far less, where is the space for us to just stop and think and look and listen and learn and do better? When we know better, we do better. So from a sector perspective, it's been crucial to be part of the conversations from the get-go, to have the opportunity to convene the sector, for them to be part of the conversation, and also to come to a point of key recommendations which have influenced the partnership agreement with key partners and have really elevated the visibility of a lot of the innovation that actually sits within this sector.
Thanks. I mean, you've said it's been important to be involved in those conversations, to be kind of in the room for those conversations. Could you give us a sense of the kinds of hurdles, the kinds of difficulties you've had talking to bits of the state when you've been trying to explain to them, well, this is what we need, this is how it actually works? What's that like?
In fairness to my state colleagues, you know, we look into a local authority and we see a local authority, not a beast of a system with different portfolios and pressures and statutory responsibilities. We just look in and see the council. And the same in turn for our local authority colleagues and combined authority colleagues. They look into this space of the third sector, and what they see can feel really complex and messy and disorganised. And where do you begin? Where's the front doors? And there's advocacy. And, you know, one of the strengths we have in this city region is a unique position that for each of our boroughs, there is an umbrella infrastructure body like mine in each place. We also organise ourselves in a collegiate called VS6 to give our combined authority a front door, and our local authorities have a front door. It's our constituent parts. We hold the relationships, we understand the challenges, we know the offer. Think of it as a marketplace. We know what needs to happen to stimulate that market, to support that market, to maximise and ramp up parts of the third sector, because there's also an argument that over time public sector has gone into spaces maybe it's not the best place to be. You know, it shouldn't necessarily be a public sector response or solution. Can it be a community-led, community-powered solution? So I think we're fortunate in the city region that we have that architecture, and we have the maturity and the relationships to really understand the points we meet as constituent parts, and that this is about shared outcomes. That ultimately, in all of this agenda, the why and the so what is the same homework question. It's about people. It's about better outcomes for people. And often we get distracted from the outcomes because we've got to meet the outputs and the needs. So for us, you know, I always say it's not about the money. It's about the relationships, it's about the spaces. And once we define what the outcomes are that together we want to secure, then we can have more mature conversations about the resource available to enable us to secure those outcomes together.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think this is a good moment to bring you in now, Kirsty. You've been patiently waiting while we talk about your patch as well. As you've got, I think, got things to say here. OPSI is obviously, as we've been saying, a leading example of how a different model could be explored that sets out a position for the regional authority and skin in the game for the regional authority to make change happen with public services. So can you give us a sense of OPSI's work? Give us a sense of also what you think you would need from central government, since this feels like, as I said at the start, a moment of opportunity, to enable more of this program.
Yeah, it's been really interesting hearing the debate and conversation so far. I think from our point of view in the combined authority, we think we've got a really instrumental role in bringing partners together around the public service innovation side, and I think we've kind of touched on the different elements of that. For us, when we look at the city region, we've got a growing economy, we've got sector strengths, we're bringing jobs in. I mean, that's all fantastic. It's great to see the city region kind of economically thriving, but we want that growth to benefit the people who are living in the city region. And when you look across the city region, you can see these real pockets where that isn't touching the lives of people who've got kind of often intergenerational challenges and problems that are facing them, and lots of interconnected issues. And I think it was interesting in one of the questions earlier, because for us, almost not delivering those services gives us that space that the NHS, the health services, social services just don't have. All those services have to deal with the crisis that is presenting at the door. We don't run any of those services. We are a strategic body. That actually gives us an easier way to bring partners together. We don't have a vested interest in any one of those services. We've just got an agenda about how do we bring those together and make the most difference collectively. So that collective ownership of what we're trying to do is really, really fundamental for us. So that's the relationship with the local authorities, it's the relationship with the universities, with the third sector. It's really cross-cutting. I do think we've got quite a unique role in that, and also quite a unique perspective, because again, a lot of those issues that face people in the city region are across the city region. They're in quite small pockets sometimes, but actually the lessons that we can learn from one part of the city region can be transferred to somewhere else. So again, the role that we can play in bringing people together to facilitate that, I think is really fundamental. So for us, OPSI is about how we have the right framework and partnerships and relationships to help do that and enable a real shift into prevention and early intervention work. I think there's two kind of key fundamental parts of the OPSI approach. One is, how do we use data and technology better? You know, we are living in an increasingly kind of digital world. How do we use that to try and make public services more efficient, to join up some of the data across services that we know can be hard to do, but actually it's not impossible. And as Sue said, you know, through a lot of the work that data cooperatives been leading, we can show that that's a real opportunity for us. And again, it can help with a lot of the prevention agenda. How do you start to spot where problems might materialise, and how do you get in ahead of those? So data and digital are really fundamental for us. But that community role that you've just described is the other part of this. So we can bring people together, we can have those relationships, and we can use data to help target public services more efficiently. But we've also got to work with community organisations like yours, because we need that bridge. So if you're looking to do more on the early intervention and prevention side, often the services that can provide that support might not be very welcome at the houses that we actually want to support. So how can we work with organisations like yours that bridge that and help people to get access to that support at a really early stage, sometimes before they even realise that they need it. So that community basis for us is really fundamental. I think that shift in how we're approaching things through OPSI, away from really long-term, you need a 5-year programme, you evaluate it at the end, and then you look back and see whether it worked or not. You know, we've had that a lot, and we've also had that with a lot of small-scale pilots that come and go. And, you know, you do your pilot, and then the money runs out. There's an evaluation at the end. Nobody really looks at it, and then we will try and do the same thing again the next time, you know, there's some money to bid for. For us, trying to think, how do we enable a culture about testing things and learning from those as we go? So, you know, the Cabinet Office Test, Learn and Grow approach is one example of that for central government. How can we work with central government across the piece to look at how we learn from things as we go, and where it works, can we scale it up quickly rather than having to wait further down the line? If it's not working, can we shift, pick up something that is, and then implement that instead? So that kind of more real-time learning, again, for us is a real different approach, that if central government back that beyond some of the kind of initiatives that exist at the moment, that would make a really big difference. Then the other area for us with central government, you know, you've seen a lot around the devolution agenda and the role that combined authorities have around economic opportunities and capital budgets in particular. And you kind of touched on the role of city regions and where devolution came from. We've seen capital budgets devolved, and hopefully, you know, increasingly devolved to us through things like the integrated settlements that we'll be getting. That means we can align our housing investment with our transport investment and make sure people can get to jobs. And so that's fantastic, but we haven't seen that kind of thinking about some of our more public service budgets. So we are still seeing kind of pilots that come and kind of initiatives which come and land from one department but aren't actually joined up at that local level. Now, we can do some of that join up because we can try and connect the dots and we can bring people together and play that convening role, but we're trying to fix something which has come to us in different pockets from different departments. So I think we'd be really keen to work with government about what would an actual place-based public service settlements start to look like, and how could we deliver that at a real local level? Because being able to work again with sort of local organisations means that we can target some of that more effectively than you ever could with a national programme, which can't see the kind of local circumstances. Finally, I was just going to touch on the coterminosity issue, because we are one of the city regions that doesn't have aligned boundaries across all of our public services. I think it is a challenge when you don't. It doesn't make things impossible. I think a lot of it, you can actually still do fantastic work with relationships. So if you look at the work that we do with the police, with the PCCs, for example, we can do that in spite of having some of the geography kind of issues that we've got where it's not aligned. It probably would make things simpler, but actually making sure you've got those relationships in place, I think that collaboration is really important. I think if government is serious about aligning boundaries, then actually all departments kind of understanding that is really critical. We've got a different boundary, larger boundary with our Integrated Health Care Board, which covers Cheshire and Merseyside. Our police boundary, on the other hand, is smaller because it doesn't include Halton for us. So that kind of message about what is government as a whole looking for from this, and those kind of clear messages going to partners as well as to ourselves, again, that would probably be something that we'd be really keen to continue supporting and helping government to shape some of the thinking about how do you get from where we are making things work locally to, if they're serious about aligning boundaries, what do we need to do to get into that place?
Yeah, well, the coterminosity penny may or may not be dropping in the halls of Whitehall. We will soon see. I want to pick up on something you said towards the end there, because one of the things I'm trying to train myself out of in conversations like this is assuming that the obvious case is obvious, that these things shouldn't just sit centrally. You said just now, I think you said something about, well, look, central government can't see the context as easily. You said, well, Whitehall's so fractured, they can't piece things together. Do you want to just elaborate on that? Why wouldn't we just sit this in central government? I'm playing devil's advocate.
Well, I think we have been sitting it in central government, and I think we haven't solved the problem. So I think a kind of starting point for us has been, we have got central departments with their own remits, and we do see where, for example, if you've got a Department for Work and Pensions programme, which is focused on a particular age group, and you can see from a national analysis of why you would need to focus on a particular age group to get people into work, that makes perfect sense. But actually, if the job opportunities and the demographics we've got in the city region aren't like that, we're focusing on the wrong group. So that targeting can be really difficult. You're either expecting a central department to have a myriad of different subsets of that programme which take account of local circumstance, or you have to work with people that are already local to understand the local circumstance. Before I went and joined the Combined Authority, I confess I was in central government and civil service. And I think I always felt when I was in the civil service that you really struggled to see that. So you could see that there were decisions which made perfect sense from a national point of view, skills and training and employment. But actually the way in which those played out at a local level would be very different in very different parts of the country. Now you can pick some of that up through the kind of the evaluations and the data, but by that time you've already done the programme and it's a bit too late to make that difference. I think we've probably got the right scale, and I appreciate what you say. There's probably a sweet spot of how large do you have to be, but not too large to make this work. And I think that's, for us, you've still got to be able to work with partners locally, so you've got to have enough closeness to those localities and communities that you can see and you understand, even if not the communities ourselves, but you know who does. And I think that, again, if you're looking at central Whitehall, it's very difficult for a central department to know that you exist. So we know that you exist, but actually if you're expecting a central department to know that across the whole country, that becomes really difficult to manage. So I think that role for me in bridging between where is it that central government can see the national picture and what is it that the national policies are trying to do, but then understanding how that is going to play out at a very local level. You need that strategic body, in my view, that sits in the middle of that. If you just have the very local, everybody's very busy trying to deal with the immediate circumstances, very understandably, and especially when it comes to statutory services, has to do that. hasn't been until combined authorities were in this space, anything that can bridge between central government and local.
That's really helpful, thank you. Look, we'll open up to audience questions in just a moment. I'm going to abuse my position for 1.5 more questions, because I feel like everyone on the panel may have something to say on this. By its very nature, innovative practice, being experimental, being creative, implies, I think, two things. One is that sometimes experiments go a bit wrong, so there has to be some kind of tolerance for fail states here, things going wrong and learning from it. The second is that even if things go quite well, the practice of innovation, which will require resource, outpaces the evidence base that it produces, which means that making that case more broadly, perhaps to Whitehall, to ministers, can actually be really challenging. So I think there's a sort of a dual challenge there. One is tolerating things not going well, failure, and the other is figuring out how to make the case for something when the evidence base is always a few steps behind the practice itself. Who on the panel would like to jump in on one of those or both? Anyone?
Well,
Jack?
I'm happy to add some reflections. I think you mentioned organisation earlier, and organisational and political cultures are clearly a big part of this. And there are lots of organisations that don't have the stomach to iterate and to put some money into a pot and work out whether or not there are different approaches. So I think organisational culture and political culture is definitely one thing. I just wanted to pick up on the point of kind of testing, and we've talked about the challenge around this being a kind of too big a scale, it's sat at government. There are also examples where it's too small a scale as well, and I think homelessness is a really good example where combined authorities have begun to show the kind of fruits of their labour. So, and I'll kind of temper the London centricity in this room, but in London we've been working with Community Citizens UK and lots of their service designers and residents that they work with, and they keep saying to us, we've got all of these people that are homeless, and in particular in hotels, and those individuals in hotels are kind of digitally excluded because, and I didn't know this, but some hotels still charge for Wi-Fi, which seems strange to me.
Travel, for instance.
Yeah, for instance, exactly. And then those local authorities also say, we want to use your ground floor and put some of our social care staff in there at the bottom. And basically Travelodge and others say, we don't care about you, local authority, because you're not really big enough to care about. And so they tell these local authorities to go away. What I think a mayor and a combined authority can do is they can have the kind of institutional and political capital to convene, that important word that we often talk about, to kind of set the rules of the game or to create a framework or an MOU or whatever it might be with these large organisations that they don't go and deliver. It's the local authority staff and social care that go into those places and might support them, but help kind of set that out practically. And I don't think that both government can do that, but also local authorities aren't equipped to do that as well. And can I just make one quick reflection on data infrastructure, which is incredibly dry but incredibly important. I'm struck time and time again how little institutions know about residents. So one organisation I'm working with sends people into referral pathways. It has no idea how many people it sends into employment pathways and what the outcomes of those are. And so it doesn't actually really know whether some of these pathways are effective. And so being able to monitor, I appreciate the pace at which, or the scale at which that information is kind of digested and realised is slightly longer in the distance, but making sure that you're designing systems in a kind of explicit way, such as this, where you're putting data at the heart and want to know what you're going to measure and see at the end of it in terms of outcomes, I think is really crucial. And while testing and iterating is fantastic and is flexible, often that can be, I think, kind of code for doing something a bit half-hearted and jumping straight into it. And so we really need to be clear that these sorts of approaches do put data at the centre. And I'll just make one final riff off of that. Some local authorities are developing these sorts of approaches, and some of them call them kind of hypothesis-led approaches, where they're being quite collaborative and they're working within their places and within their communities, and they're saying to those individuals and institutions, what are our kind of assumptions, or what are the challenges that we face, or what should we do? And then they're kind of testing them in a kind of methodical way. I think one of the key differences between local authorities and combined authorities is local authorities are incentivised to see public service innovation in the context of a kind of short-term financial saving because they have a statutory requirement and so on. I think combined authorities have much more kind of freedom and space and latitude to experiment in that kind of more holistic way.
Thank you so much, Jack. Rachel, I saw you sort of, did you want to jump in on this? You look like you did.
Yeah, just a reminder that it starts with co-design, doesn't it? And if we haven't got communities in the room and that rich qualitative data of a lived experience of, growth, development, what works, because I would say it's about meeting in the middle. There is lots of fantastic examples happening outside this hotel right now where communities need to be met in very innovative ways because there might be no money attached to it. It might be based on the relationship, the ability to wrap around the individual and their complexity, but it might be so small that it's perceived value to be captured and the key ingredients learnt from in terms of replicability and scale up, because often as a sector our frustrations can come from innovating on a daily basis to meet the needs, often with little to no resource to do it, and the lack of visibility and value of that intervention. But there is value in that intervention. So there's also, from our perspective, a pushback, and our combined authority colleagues have really been responsive, listening, coming into our spaces and listening to these thoughts and opinions from the sector of, to get to the solutions, we need to look with breadth and depth at where the solutions lie. And that in itself needs capacity to look at the breadth and the depth of the solutions and start those conversations about scalability, replicability, because not everything can be designed by officers. I don't mean any disrespect in that, but it can't. It's got to be this cross-fertilisation of knowledge, skills, data in its broadest sense. And for us, OPSI is that space and that vehicle. So we really welcome it.
Thank you. And I think that point you made about a valuable thing being hard to see sometimes because it's a quote unquote small intervention, harder to see, but nevertheless valuable, I think is really well made. Both Kirsty and Sue want to come in. Kirsty, should we go with you first and then Kirsty?
Yeah, a really interesting question, because I think for us it is a real shift in culture and behaviour, and people agree with your points about how organisations need to change. But it isn't about doing something without proper planning and analysis and capturing the data about what's working, so it has to still be done in a really robust way. I think one of the things we've found is you need to capture the learning as you go along. And you need to capture where that is taking place and where you can start to see that impact. And that might not be actually with the service that is delivering some of that. It might be with a different service, it might be that you can capture it through the community engagement. So there will be an impact wherever that is felt. We need to be able to capture that more broadly. And again, that kind of joining up across services is really critical there, because if you're doing one intervention, with a community organisation, for example, we may find that the impact is actually by somebody not presenting for a health problem. That being able to capture that is really critical for us, and then being able to extrapolate from that to say, well, if we were able to scale that, what would we start to see, and being able to make those assumptions, but based very much on a kind of real-time evaluation of what's actually happening. So I think that's the critical bit for me. It does require a kind of degree of change in culture and behaviour and what you're looking for, but alongside that, you need a real robustness in the data that you're capturing and the evaluation that you're doing, so that it isn't just let's try something and then see if we like it or not. It's much more about actually let's see where those impacts are going to be felt, and then making small adjustments as you need to. and learning from that. And the other thing I would say is, again, part of the OPSI work, I think, is capturing where things are already happening. So there is a lot of data and evaluation about projects and programs that are already making a difference, but often they're in really small examples across the city region and they haven't been able to scale. And potentially that's because they haven't got enough money or because they are defined in a certain geographical area because of who's running them or because of the funding constraints. What we can do is have a look at that and capture that learning where it does exist and then think, how could we find a partner to work with elsewhere in the city region to look at the expansion. So there is data already out there about what works in this space. Just we need to capture it and then help share that learning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sue. So thank you for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. And Kirsty's finished a few things I was going to say. That always happens when you come last. But I was going to talk about the organisational culture and values because I think that's really important in terms of how to answer this question and how to sort of move from that how to build the risk tolerance in terms of what's being done. And it's a long term to create the cultures that are needed with this. And I think one area to think about, something we've been doing at the Heseltine Institute, is about design thinking in public policy. So how do you design in and create things in a different way when you're doing this work? So I think there's lots of different ways, things that you can apply to this. I think there's the balance when we're talking about the metrics of there's a lot of feedback loops intended to be built in to this model. So how do we get those working and how do we get messages across from a qualitative perspective? And how do we get some case studies and show what it means to individuals as they go through the system? Because that's always a powerful way to play back to funders.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, look, I think we've got about 10 or 12 minutes on the clock. Do we have any questions from the audience? Back in the corner there. Hello.
Hello. Neil Amos from PA Consulting. Thanks very much, everyone. There seems to be two themes running in all the comments you're making. One is about things that are requiring a top-down approach. We're talking about aligning boundaries, sorting out funding, potentially redesigning the role of central government departments. But we're also talking about things that need to be driven from the community level, to be agile, quick, responsive, spot whether things are working, and change. Are they? I'm trying to work out in my mind how those two things are compatible. Are they? Do both have to happen? And if so, how do we really achieve that?
Well, by having a city region sized. Sorry, I jumped the gun on that. That's a really, really good question because I think you're right. There's a little bit of a cross purpose there. Thank you so much for that question. Let's take one more, and then we'll. Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks, Simon. Hello, folks. I'm Kate Arden, and I'm a former director of public health for Wigan, but I work with Restate on their Reimagining Health programme. So I was involved very heavily with the development of the Wigan deals. Which of course was about that sense of concept of place. One of the things that strikes me about all of your comments, and I think Liverpool City Region with OPSI is in probably the ideal position to do this. It's about creating that compelling narrative of place. Richard, you're articulating it brilliantly. And I think the civic data programme, and I've done some work with Ian Buchanan on this, it really does need to not just capture the facts and the figures and the statistics, which are great in many ways, and Kirsty, you're absolutely right, that's what funders need. But it needs, and I think very particularly at this time, to create a compelling narrative for local people that actually helps rebuild trust in civic society. And combined authorities actually are in a unique position to be able to do this, but Liverpool, the Liverpool City Region, with its rich investment in culture and heritage and history, in other words, the shape skills of the universities, not just the STEM skills, I think has the ability to demonstrate this. So, I guess the question back to you is, what are you doing to think about that compelling narrative of place? And the next 4 years, I would argue are really, really important for this, possibly the next 12 months.
Brilliant questions. Thank you. So we've got the question about how you tell the story of place, create a compelling narrative that makes all of this work. I think a really big challenge for public authorities and for their partners. And then we've got the idea that the conditions we're describing on this panel are both top down and bottom up. So how do you make that coherent? How do you do both of those things at the same time? Anyone on the panel want to jump in on any of that?
I'm happy to give it a first go. So in terms of the, I'll take the second question first, but in terms of that narrative about place, for me it's got to be a place narrative that is based with working with people in the place, i.e. it can't just be a combined authority narrative about a place, because that is not going to resonate with everyone across the city region. I think you're right, we're in a really strong position. There's a real engagement from across stakeholders, whether that is cultural sector or private sector or public sector. There's real buy-in to this, and I think that is in part because we see there's kind of three main drivers probably for the work that we're trying to bring together, and we do see ourselves as bringing together and providing that kind of framework and collaborative kind of space for people to come together. It isn't just a combined authority driven programme, it's something people have to buy into and be part of. And I think those three reasons, partly it's about economic growth. You know, we are still a body which, you know, strategic aims, we're looking to grow the economy of the city region. If we don't do something about some of these long-standing challenges, we will hold back our productivity, and we will hold back that economic growth. So that, you know, is really important for an economic reason that we're looking at this. The social reason is absolutely vital. You know, this has been going on, as I said, for intergenerational time. We need to really tackle these challenges and to improve outcomes for people that are in the city region. And the third kind of connects those two. So yes, we're seeing growth and that's great. We've still got those long-standing challenges that we need to tackle. And if we're not careful, that disconnect and the lack of trust that you've touched on, that people feel between, we're talking about growth, we're talking about jobs, and yet their experience is not that, it's quite the opposite. So us joining that together from a kind of civic point of view is really crucial as well. So I think because we've approached it with those three things in mind, that's helped to get the buy-in of a lot of different organisations. So that narrative about what we can achieve as a city region, what we're already doing, where we can find the innovation and really back that and back what's happening already, but also then take that to the next level, I think is really critical. But that overall shaping can't just be ours, it has to be something which is done together. I think in terms of the question about is it top down, bottom up, is it a bit of both, and is there a tension there? I think sometimes there is tension between that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think we need to keep asking the questions about, you know, what is it that's going to keep holding us back and how do we change that? We have got to do a lot at a local level, and we can do a lot of that already. And that's where a lot of those examples about finding the innovation, changing the culture, looking at what we can do across local partners will take us quite a long way in this space. So we can do a lot already as a combined authority. But we will hit a point at which the national departments have still got their own objectives. And so if we're going to get the national players that are based locally to be part of that, they need to be freed up by their own departments to respond to that. And some of the funding arrangements don't always help that at the moment. So there's a long way we can go as it stands at the moment. But I think asking that question of if we want to build them, if we want to go further, what more could we do with central government and what does that look like? And this is still a new space for both combined authorities and local government. So working with them to look at the shape of that, you know, what is it that is still right at a national level? Well, what is it that could be done in a different way locally? I think is really critical.
Let me bring in Sue. Sue, you're sitting next to me, which means I can see you're making notes.
I was thinking, my brain's ticking over, and it's around the narrative of place, because I think it's a really good question, and the first thing that comes to mind is what's the definition of place? Because there's the city region, there's a local authority, there's a neighbourhood, there's a street, so it's a really difficult thing to do, but it's a really important question to ask in terms of how to do this. And I think this is where, when we talked before about the role of local authorities and the role of the combined authority, I think the combined authority can learn from the individual local authorities and how they prepare their own narratives of place, because they'll all be different, but within that there could be some common themes. I think the other challenge in how OPSI deals with this is because a lot of what OPSI is about is transforming public services. Most residents are not interested in public services, so that won't play into the narrative. I did work in part of Liverpool a few years ago that was about public services. The City Council were brought into this. We wanted to ask residents, you know, what they wanted for public services. They weren't interested in the services at all, so we were asking the wrong questions. So you've got to start from what are the questions that you wanted to ask of communities, and I'm sure Rachel will have some thoughts on that, but I think it's a really important strand of OPSI that probably needs to be taken away and thought through a little bit more. And there are other parts of the country who have been quite innovative in how they look at what prosperity means for areas, and they've worked on that model with their residents, and you find it's different things in different places, and that's fine. So I think it's how that sort of approach gets played into OPSI as maybe something that's maybe a wraparound part of OPSI.
Can I chuck it to you on that basis?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a role of OPSI is to convene and create those environments where we can build trust and establish that parity and equity I spoke about when I first spoke, in the relationships. Because if we don't have that, there will be tensions between top down, bottom up. But if we've got stronger relationships wrapped around those tensions, they become positive disruptors that make us think differently and challenge the status quo. Without the trusted environment and relationships, then those tensions potentially are not positive disruptors, they're just lines in the sand, and, you know, a business as usual default will come into play because it all becomes a bit too difficult and we've all got so much to do.
Really well made point. Jack, any thoughts on this before we try and get one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I reviewed the Wigan deal about 3 or 4 years ago when I worked at IPPR, and we interviewed all of the councillors that were involved in that, and what came across really clearly was that there was a shared story. At the same time, they were also quite honest that the policies themselves were quite small, but it was the story that generated quite a lot of momentum for them, and actually realised some positive outcomes rather than the policies that they implemented as a result. I was just, and of course there's obviously the Preston model as well as another example. I was just reflecting on whether or not, you know, OPSI would need a story, or whether or not OPSI is a kind of key enabler of a kind of broader story that, you know, the Mayor and others might share, and I don't know the answer to that. But just on kind of boundaries, is there a tension? I don't know. I mean, I don't think that boundaries are centrally driven. I think place and identity in particular are really contested, and that's why we see in the devolution priority programme places putting forward 3 or 4 different approaches. Of course, it was UK government that made the decision to go ahead with those sorts of agendas, and I always think that devolution is not about saying that the government should have no role. I think there's still a role for the government to set some of the rules of the game, but still it should, in doing so, empower places to, within a specific framework, make lots of those decisions. So I think that's a kind of key difference.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Do you know what? I think we are, in fact, at time. Thank you to the audience for asking those excellent questions and for sharing this time with us today. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel and Liverpool City Region for making the whole thing possible.